I see we have one more housing trust member as well. And Councilor Shan is also joining us. So. And Andrew Levine. This is great. Almost a full complement. This is great. Sorry, there's a few folks popping in. I'm just making sure that they're migrated over to panelists. I'm just waiting for them to complete the process on their end. Councilors Khan and Shan, you'll have to accept the panelist invite, I think, that you might be seeing. And Madeline, you should have that as well, I think. Okay, and we have Councilor Cameron. Okay, sorry everybody, that took a moment. I think we've got everybody now on the group migrated over. We also have some folks on the public side. My name is Andy Port, just for the record, Director of Planning and Development. That we're recording the meeting for posterity. I have an agenda up on the screen for the group. I'm just going to run through briefly what we were going to cover today and a rough timeline. And then we wanted to dive into the discussion. So first off, just a project update or a schedule update for the projects. So there are two discrete projects. One is the Story Avenue Low Street study. The other one is the MBTA communities. But as we've seen in our zoning advisory group and the other discussions that boards and committees have been having on MBTA communities, we've had the option to choose more than just one place where we're taking credit for MBTA communities. So we've been parsing that piece out. We haven't quite completed the analysis to determine where we want to do the mapping. So I'm hesitant to say that we've completely closed the door on that, although that seems to be where everybody's tracking. So that being the case, I think today's discussion is largely focused on essentially expansions to the 40R district and trying to hone in on the option that that best serves that. But the things to note, I guess, are that given that that actually, if we're able to parse those two apart, that makes both of those initiatives relatively much simpler, I would say, for each of them. And also doesn't constrain some of the Story Avenue Low Street area quite the same if it's not under MBTA. That being said, the other important note about our schedule is that we have a grant extension for the Low Street Story Avenue study area. So we'll have more time frame to spend on that. And just like we've been talking about to date, the most important thing for us right now is to determine where do we want to satisfy MBTA communities. And if we're completely parsing off the Story Ave Low Street area, all the better. That becomes easier. But we do need to complete that process for MBTA communities first. So that's what we're focused on today. Recapping from the last meeting, I'll put up on the screen for a discussion in a bit the criteria that we discussed to review the district mapping areas, to kind of rank them and prioritize why we're choosing those areas. So we'll pull those up for reference and ranking, so to speak. We identified some districts for modeling, and I think it's worthwhile for me to review those sketch maps real quick with folks, just so you're familiar with what they are. We don't have to run through every scenario. There's actually a sketch map that Rick had done that's pretty helpful to just kind of visualize overall. And as I've said before, there are these primary districts that we've been mapping, district areas outside the 40R here, that we've talked about expanding it into. But there's also what I would call variations on a theme, which is a very small iteration of those same scenarios, maybe add a parcel here, delete a parcel there. I think the larger focus is on those bigger pieces, and then we can look at that variation on a theme from there, smaller variation on one of those. Just real quick, I just wanted to illustrate the areas that we've looked at in some of our options. This is not inclusive of every option that folks have thrown out. And just to be clear, Ian, who's with us from MBPC, was not able to run every single scenario. Some of those scenarios were given or routed around or thrown out in other discussions after the zoning advisory group. So the last meeting we had, so he hasn't quite had an ability to run those through the modeling yet. So we'll speak to the ones that we're able to speak to today in terms of the numbers and the options, and then we'll take it from there. But just in general, there was discussion about 40 Parker Street. We don't have a number on that, although I'll defer to Ian. He may be able to speak to that in a moment. I don't believe we had a number earlier today on this parcel alone or by itself, but there was some discussion about that.
I have one now, Andy. Sorry to cut you off.
Oh,
I just
okay.
did that earlier.
Okay, great. Thank you. So when we get to that in a moment, if you don't mind speaking to that, that's great. Thank you. I know there's some debate about whether or not this parcel gets included or not, if anything happens here. And having that number will be helpful to us just to understand how that lot would play a role, if at all. So we had the Hines Way piece that we had mentioned previously. The Parker Street to Graff Road, Parker Street without 40 Parker Street. We had the Route 1 to Enpro. We talked about eliminating the cemetery component, looking something up here. So we'll see that in a moment. And then I'm skipping over the Story Ave Low Street area scenarios, unless someone feels reason to go back there. So we talked about from there, we talked about modifying the Enpro area, whatever name we want to give that. We talked about using area on the hillside area, but one thing that was tossed out as an idea since then by planning board member Bob Coop, who's I think is with us in the audience, was suggesting that we might consider on the other side of the rail trail here, the bridge, utilizing some of these lots that are actually fronting on Low Street, and possibly skipping over this driveway here, but trying to use that and make the case that these are contiguous with a rationale for exception with this land in the back. That's something for Ian and I and the rest to discuss, because we have to consider how the state reviews the district continuity. At any rate, the idea here is to look at this stretch here. There are pros and cons to that, which we'll touch base on in terms of the unit count. This all goes back to how things are calculated and, various different parameters that can impact what the unit count ends up being with the state. So we'll talk about that. And then we'll talk a little bit about the possible addition of these lots across the bridge. Like I mentioned, this would be the sort of the Timberline site here. The Elks site right here, and these parcels in between. So we did have some conversation about whether or not, things are going further in the business park. This is at the edge and facing Low Street. So I think the idea there was that might be a logical connection, and depending on what we find about the impact of these hillside lots. We did also talk a little bit about the Back Bay neighborhood idea. I don't know if there was a broad consensus for exploring that one further, but this was a larger area that would have taken up to the CVS and wrapped back down again, and also grabbed the Empro site. And then there were some other variations, if you will, as playing around with lots for Parker Street. The idea of going only sort of halfway down Parker Street was thrown out as an idea as well. And then a so-called Parker Street jog of following 1 Boston Way, where we have the development there, 1 and 3 Boston Way, and picking up on the other side of Boston Way, heading down Parker Street, and then only utilizing the ones on this side at the jog, but not necessarily the ones at the corner. We didn't complete our conversation either at the zoning advisory group or at this week's planning and development or planning board meetings about this is sort of still an open discussion about if this is extended as a district, how far it goes. But we did talk a little bit about whether or not it will go to that intersection. So that's just a quick overview of some of the options that we considered. So we have some modeling numbers and information we'll show in a minute from Ian. I think at this point, it probably makes sense to hand over to Ian if you wanted to either share screen or I think importantly, maybe speak to some of the compliance model constraints. We have talked about them a little bit before. And while we don't need to go into the weeds, I think that for people just understand that there are certain factors like excluded areas or using whole parcels or district continuity. There's also some other things that you've been focused on in our model that impact the unit count. And there's essentially a range of count that we're talking about right now because of that. So maybe I don't know if you want to share a screen, I'm happy to share numbers or what I have on my end, but if you wouldn't mind speaking to that might be helpful for the group as well.
Yeah, definitely. I'll speak to it a little bit first and then share screen to talk about some numbers. Good to be with you all again. For folks that I haven't met in the group or that are in the public, Ian Burns, Merrimack Valley Planning Commission. I oversee the Community and Economic Development team at the Commission. We're assisting 9 cities and towns in the Merrimack Valley right now with compliance with MBTA communities. And the caveat for folks in the public that might be watching, we did not write the regulations or the law. We are helping communities implement the law to the best of our ability. So as Andy just mentioned, we took the parcels that you all had selected last week around the Enpro site and around Parker Street to see what they could potentially yield for your unit capacity, basing them off the dimensional parameters that you currently have in your 40R district. As I was working through some of the numbers, a few things I want to clarify, and why when we talk about them, there's going to be a range attached to each one, is because the way that the 40R zoning is written is slightly different than the way the compliance model interprets some of the dimensional parameters. So to give you some details on that, for example, density. In your 40R zoning with the city, density is defined as the density of developable land of parcels. However, the compliance model that the state uses considers density across the entirety of the parcel. So what it does is it sets a cap on a parcel given the density limit that is written, but it considers, even if there's wetland, that counts towards the total land area of the density calculation. However, in the 40R zoning bylaw that the city has right now, you take out those undevelopable lands before calculating the potential density of a parcel.
And so Ian,
what we have,
Ian, sorry if I could jump in. So the highlight there is just that can essentially diminish or dilute the density that we have to reach with the state, right?
Right. And so if when we talk to the state about the way they want us to model that, what that might do is essentially reduce the numbers that the compliance model shows, because the compliance model assumes that your cap on a parcel is based on density across the entirety of the parcel. But your zoning assumes that the cap on units in density is only on the developable land of that parcel. And so what we've done is we've done a calculation both based off of the state's version of density and your bylaws version of density to show a range, because it's not clear to us yet how the state will want us to adjust their own calculations for Newburyport's case and Newburyport's definition of density. So I've put a range of numbers out there of what we think the minimum yield will be unit-wise, and then what we think the maximum could be, depending on where the state lands on either side of that.
And Ian, if I could add, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is because 40R, the terminology that was used for the developable area under 40R, this is essentially a comparable example of, for those communities that do have a grandfathered 40R smart growth district, they would have a similar issue in the sense that they're using the same terminology for defining the calculations under the 40R zoning. And here under MBTA, they have the same issue, so to speak.
Right, exactly. So essentially the state is looking, let's say you have a 10-acre lot and 5 acres of that is wetland. According to your 40R bylaw, you only use those 5 acres and multiply it by your density capacity to get how many units could be on that site. According to the state's calculations, they take the entire 10-acre parcel, multiply it by the density capacity to get the total unit number on that site. So that's the difference that we're talking about and why it could be less when we end up going through the entire process. The one other thing that is different in Newburyport's bylaw from the way the state calculates unit capacity is building footprint. And so when the state uses the compliance model, it essentially assumes that there is one perfect block of a building that gets put on a site. So the compliance model calculates, given open space requirements, setbacks, surface parking, what the maximum size of a building footprint could potentially be on a site, and then just uses that footprint to come up with a number that you could fit for units inside of that footprint. Newburyport's bylaw specifies that the maximum building footprint is a maximum of 10,000 square feet. And so what that might cause an issue with is, let's say you have a parcel that is, an acre, and we end up finding out per the compliance model that the maximum building footprint is 20,000 square feet. Well, we know that in Newburyport's case, we'd have to split that building up, and that would create more open space. The compliance model calculates just that 20,000 square foot footprint and maximizes that to the full extent to get a unit capacity calculation. And so what we'll have to do is work with the state to figure out a way to factor in essentially the additional setback that is required between two buildings if you have two 10,000 square foot buildings versus one 20,000 square foot or something to that effect. So those are kind of the two main pieces we're working with, and why when we talk about numbers today, they are not final and they are arranged. Next week, I'll be on a call with the state to ask them some more specific questions about how they want us to calculate this as a part of their modeling. Are there
Ian,
questions about that before I hop into the numbers? I want to talk about that
Ian,
more.
I
Yeah.
have a question about the parking. You said that the state's model assumes surface parking, correct?
Yes.
So in the cases like Newburyport, where we're getting some parking below grade under the building, we presumably could get a higher unit count than the state would model, correct?
You might be able to, but the state is assuming surface parking and they haven't really wavered from that because it's not a guarantee the developer will do underground parking.
Right. So,
Yep.
so in terms of actual production, we may do better than our formal unit capacity calculation.
Agreed. Yeah.
Yeah, you could. At the same time, what we find is that the model in itself really overestimates what might happen. And so it might just be that it's a wash and it evens out in the end if you have underground parking. Because again, the compliance model is saying if you have a perfect box of a building at 1,000 square feet for each unit, this is what you get. And so it's not always perfect. Any other questions about those few factors before we talk about some of the districts? It's really confusing and wonky stuff. So I just wanted to leave that space. All right. Andy, would you like me to share my screen with some of those numbers now, or do you want to pull it up on the spreadsheet you had? I can grab it.
We had a chance to discuss specifically that. My thought is actually just to orient people with the spreadsheet they're familiar with previously. And what I said, what I had done was I had taken some of the numbers that you sent over today. So folks, what you're seeing is a table that you should be generically familiar with from our discussion last time. And I'll, Ian, you're welcome to sort of take the screen, but I wanted to just, I thought for consistency with how the group's been looking at it before, we were looking at a variety of options. And so you have this sort of column here indicating what's happening. I would say for this example, this version of the spreadsheet here, ignore everything that you're seeing here. With the exception of what I've done here is, and Ian, correct me if there's anything you want to adjust in what I'm saying here based on the numbers you sent today. What Ian has sent over today was calculations based on as much as he was able to run through the modeling of some of the zoning advisory group mapping options. However, there's some variations on that that we discussed a moment ago that were thrown out after that. And so those haven't been run through yet. So what I did was I've put into here the existing 40R, sorry, the MBTA requirement, existing 40R build out. And this is with as Ian mentioned, a range, so 862 to 930. What I have done for our purposes of discussion here, a reference, and again, I'm happy to defer to Ian if he thinks is a better way of looking at other information here. But my thought was that using the lower number, again, as a sort of a caution and recognizing, as we've talked about in some of these meetings before, having a buffer in case there's any dispute with the state about how things are, running through the model. And especially given the unique provisions that the state's model do not take into account, and therefore they have to give us some interpretation of how they want us to apply it. What I've done here is just for conservative purposes, put the 862 as opposed to the 930. So with that, I ran just these highlighted, if you ignore everything else and look at just these highlighted, these sort of greenish, hopefully you can see the distinction there, just these three. What I did was I took the scenarios that we had in our maps there. Because 40 Parker Street was not one that was run through the model, except for Ian can speak to that in a minute and I can plug it in. We didn't have, as of earlier today, any of these scenarios that had 40 Parker Street. So I didn't plug those new numbers in there. Those are still left untouched. I'm not speaking to these other two here. So what I was able to do was plug in what we do have from that data set from today. So that covers this without 40 Parker Street, and it covers Parker Street with that jog that I showed. And in this model, just for illustrative purposes, and we can sort of take it from there, is what you're seeing is the 862 that we get out of at the low end of our 40R district leaves us at 430. So it's about 6 units more than we were talking about last time at the sort of worst end, if we're having a discussion with the state and some debate about how that ranges. Let's say conservatively we need 430 units. So we didn't model for this Parker, these scenarios, we didn't model 20 units an acre for these first two on Parker Street. We were talking about the 30 and 40 units an acre. So skip those two and we'll go down here at 30 units an acre, the Parkers to Graff Road. And this wraps the corner. So on that map, this is wrapping that area. This does not include 40 Parker Street, but it is done at 30 units an acre and at 40 units an acre. And then the same thing for this Parker Street jog scenario, 30 units an acre and 40 units an acre. I put in parentheses underneath the ranges that Ian had given us on those. But again, I had plugged in only the lower number just for conservative purposes here. And then you see both the 30 and the 40 here. In the case of Route 1 to Hillside, we had talked about using a lower density. So we had talked about we didn't do the 40 units an acre as a model or a scenario. We did actually 20 units and 30 units. So I plugged those two in. So what you're seeing down at the bottom again is that adjustment based on those new numbers, adjustment down there at the bottom as to whether we have to create any more units within if we were to use one of these scenarios, whether we have to create any more units or whether we've reached the threshold. So that's just a quick illustration of between the data that Ian was able to run, plugging it into some of the scenarios that we had. I don't have, and Ian can certainly speak to it now as part of anything he wants to go over, the number on 40 Parker Street, which can inform this table and plug in for some of these other options. This does not have in here, we don't have in here the number for the sort of additions to the MPro area that were mentioned that are sort of the Elks site and the Timberline. So this does not have that yet.
Andy, the one thing I would add is that for the densities, so we had, of course, 30 units an acre and 40 units an acre. For each of those, the 30 units an acre densities, we assumed 3-story height limit. And for the 40 units an acre density, we assumed a 4-story height limit. For the 20 units an acre density, I still assumed a 3-story height limit. I didn't change that to 2 stories.
That would be correct, I think.
And
yeah.
so that was the assumption I went with. And so if that needs to change, the group should let us know.
Again, I'll defer to group discussion, but I think that's a reasonable assumption there. So, Ian, did you want to show anything else? Or I know you had done the way that you had broken it down or whatnot, but this was compared to the actual options that folks were sort of mapping out. These are the ones that I was able to plug in from that. I know you said you have a new number for 40 Parker Street that might inform what that lot alone, I guess, would end up being.
Yeah, if you want, I can show one quick thing. And then I'm also happy to, I think there was interest in breaking this down. We don't have to do it this second, but folks wanted to see kind of the parcel by parcel breakdown if you wanted to pick and choose which ones as part of some of these districts.
Right.
This is essentially what Andy was just showing. It's what I had sent him, kind of a summary version of Andy's table there. And so you have up here your 40R A district and B, and then the total. And then here are those Parker Streets at 3 stories, 4 stories, 30 units an acre, 40 units an acre, and those low and high estimates. Adding in, Andy just took a look at this, the 40 Parker. Right now, we're looking at a minimum of 538 at the 40 units an acre scenario and a minimum of 403 at the 30 units an acre scenario.
And that's a pretty big number for a parcel, so to speak, but at the same time, it's a very large parcel that has very little excluded land on it, correct? And that's the primary reason why it's such a large number for, say, one parcel.
Right. And again, this speaks to the limitations of the model in the sense that the model assumes you have one structure on that site. And so it's basically saying if your building footprint here is 80,000 square feet, that's how many units you could pack in there. We know in reality that's probably not going to happen, but that's why we say the model tends to overestimate.
Right. And as you pointed out, in our district, we have a size limitation on the building footprint, although that there is some flexibility, to present something to the board. It starts there to keep the massing small. And so here we recognize we wouldn't have something that large as a structure on the lot. Ian, anything else you wanted to speak to there?
No, I will say, I think it's probably helpful for folks to look at some of these numbers. So I'll go back to it in a second, but just to show you an example, we do have, this is each of those districts on that previous tab broken down by parcel. And so as folks are interested, we can take a look at the actual numbers for each parcel as well when we get down to that, if that's what the group kind of wants to parse out with each of these sub-districts. Yeah,
and I would add to that on the highlighted columns I had done there, just to show the ones where we had the new data from me and I was able to plug in back into those columns. In those columns, what I've done is I've essentially taken only those parcels from the exports from the model in that section and plugged them in. So it's essentially, as I said earlier, a variation on a theme. I've just added or deleted the parcels accordingly to see what that particular scenario. So we say Parker Street, the whole section, or Parker Street jogging, it's selecting just those parcels that we would be including in that scenario.
And the final thing I'll say before we hear anything from the group, mostly for folks in the public that might be listening, I do want to emphasize that these unit capacity estimates are a zoning analysis and not at all a build out analysis. And so it can be a lot to look at these numbers and assume that 500 units will be built on Parker Street tomorrow. That's not at all the case here. There are many other limitations, and this is really a theoretical number based off of zoning parameters. So just wanted to give that caveat.
So we had a couple of discussions. The city council had a planning and development committee meeting, and there was a planning board meeting last night. We did have overlapping discussion as we expected. We had sort of parallel discussion. Each meeting builds a little bit on the last one, but having a discussion about these various different options, that's where a few of the new variations came about. They haven't been run through the system here. The MPRO line that you're seeing here, the two lines there, at the two different densities, those are the smaller separate MPRO district. This is not the model based on the cemetery. So this is the one without at that intersection with Pond Street. This does not contemplate the additional lots that planning board member Bob Coop had suggested we look into, which is the ones over at the Timberline area. So that hasn't been run through the system yet to sort of see how that would play out in here. One, in creating a 5-acre district, in that area, but also, where it makes sense to create units and where it provides that capacity. Rick,
I saw you raise your hand.
Yeah, I was going to say, Rick or Heather, if you wanted to speak at all to some of the discussion that happened at each of the meetings, or you want to elaborate on any of that. Yeah, good.
I don't need to, I don't think there's any further discussion from the planning board meeting. It was more, a learning experience for the planning board members who haven't been involved at this point. I did have something else I want to talk about afterwards, but maybe if we hear about the planning and development committee meeting first, that would be good.
I know there was some concern raised at the planning development committee meeting about the Parker Street section that was a little bit different than the discussion we'd had at the zoning advisory group. So to me, that seems like an area that we would want to focus some of our discussion today on, about the pros and cons of that section there. That's one thing that came up. I don't know whether any of the counselors wanted to speak to the planning and development committee discussion, the input that we received there, and how that might influence any of the variations we've talked about here.
I can speak to it. So it feels like Parker Street's the only option that we're looking at here. And I am concerned about going into the business park doing residential. I know folks are trying to say that the 40R district's going to be how'd you put it, Andy? One of the villages of the city, but I have concerns with going into the business park just because you've got industry on both sides, and you start putting residential in the business park, you're going to quickly lose the business park. So I pause on using Parker Street as an option here. That was the comments that I made in the P&D, our Planning and Development Committee meeting.
Thank you.
So, happy to listen to.
I have a slightly different perspective on that, which I'm happy to speak to, but Councillor Khan, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Councillor Shand. I think that was something that was clear in yesterday's conversation. I do want to say a couple of things, though. I do feel like there were a couple of iterations, and just for Councillor Shand's benefit too, this wrap, or whatever we wanted to call it, the elbow that comes up here, that we had different iterations around Parker, and I'm just curious a little bit, with the existing, and then we also actually looked at like just the parcels abutting what is already there as maybe being a natural kind of, if you want to say, kind of, like ombres into it. It's not like it's a stark, like, okay, now we have all just residential. So there's different ways that I think we encourage maybe not going as far. I think it looks clear that maybe the elbow may not be desirable because of the points maybe being made about that. And I also want to say the Ward 5 councillor was talking about the same thing, and one of our criteria was to maintain some of the existing character. But my question to the group is, as we look at Low Street, the parcels we did not talk about grabbing and using, which are also part of the industrial, oh, wow, thank you. That's so nice. Is there a feeling from the group between the ways we try to absorb those spaces, recognizing that they're part of this larger entity that's our industrial and business park. But I do think, you know, given the MBTA community's access, I hope we could find a compromise, something that could work, but maybe not make it so such a big block of space. So that's my thoughts.
Thank you. Ed, Cameron?
Yeah, thanks. Just to reiterate, you know, from our last notes on the 28th, I mean, we did talk about sort of a general consensus around not 40 Parker Street, where the Mark Ritchie woodworking, yes, not there, thank you. Not Metro Rock, not the wind turbine, but that bluish, whether you call it an elbow or not, I definitely think the south side of that, yes. The part across the street, I'm not so sure about, and I'm not 100% opposed to extending it to Parker, extending it to Graff Road. I have driven by there several times since that meeting, and to me, you know, residential would not be a crazy thing there. And the Low Street part, yeah, maybe it's an either or. Both might be a little too much. I am sensitive to not wanting to, you know, diminish or start to crack the industrial zoning in the business park and all that. It is a very important economic driver for us. I think here, though, we're, you know, I mean, I think the compromise is that we're kind of tinkering at the margins of it, where it might make sense. It is kind of certainly the Parker Street side is, you know, that's how I come in when I come back from Boston, and most people that are coming up Scotland Road with me are taking a right there. So it is sort of an entryway. I think there could be a lot of sidewalk improvements there that, you know, a potential developer would need to pick up, which are needed around there. So, you know, I think it's finding that balance, and, you know, we'll see where the conversation goes, but I was not able to stick around for the rest of the Planning and Development Committee meeting yesterday, and I know I didn't listen to the planning board, and I know not everyone was on this ZAG last time. So I know it's a bit choppy, but hopefully we'll all be getting on the same page and just be able to hash it out. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councilor Shan?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on that. I mean, Mark Ritchie was part of the Economic Development Committee that we were in last year, and I can't remember who it was, but they had brought up the concerns they had about having residential next to them, because let's face it, when you have residential next to industrial, people are going to complain about trucks. And that part of Parker Street is where trucks get off Route 1 and go over to Scotland Road. So now you're going to have, you know, if we plan on zoning to have residential here, you're going to have one side facing the larger Mark Ritchie place, and then behind them you've got other industrial buildings. I mean, think about that, because you're going to start eroding I would say what's been helpful for that area of the city is the fact that, hey, they can have 18-wheelers going through at 5 a.m. and nobody's going to complain. They can have the noise that happens at 6 o'clock when folks are coming in, when shift change is happening. When you have residential right there, you're going to start having folks complaining. And I can just give you the input that was given to us last year during the economic development with that, Mark Ritchie's building was concerned about 40R being there, and they haven't had issues yet. But I mean, the more residential you put there, the more likely you're going to have issues. So now the section that's closer to the Inpro, this is new. Probably not as big of a concern. You don't have as much heavy traffic there, but I would say the Parker Street is one that we're going to have issues. So that's it.
Thank you, Councilor. Andrew Shapiro?
Yeah, thank you, Andy. And apologies for being off camera. I just wanted to pipe up really quickly about Parker Street. I mentioned this last time we met. I mean, my view is personally that, and I totally respect and understand everything Councilor Shan was just saying. I think those are valid concerns. With that said, I think a couple things with respect to Mark Ritchie's properties, with respect to his property specifically, you know, the irony is that a couple of his major tenants, I think, are big beneficiaries of there being residential properties nearby, having a brewery and a rock climbing facility there. So it seems like it's been somewhat complementary. And then also just noting that, and I think other people have said something to this effect, that the properties along the southern end of Parker Street, where like the leather factory or tannery, whatever it is, I mean, those are somewhat marginal as far as the level of business they're doing in comparison to some other businesses elsewhere in the industrial park. So I don't know that we're losing anything, so to speak, and we're not losing anything anyway, because again, this is going to be an overlay. So to the extent that those properties want to continue on as industrial properties, I don't see that as being an obstacle if that's what is ends up being economically viable for them. But in the case that they're not, there'll be this opportunity to continue on with the 40R district. So I see it as a good opportunity. I just wanted to pipe in to say that.
Thank you, Drew. I just for myself, and well, others, please jump in. Just for myself, I don't have the concern as much about. I definitely appreciate all the perspectives on the Parker Street section and the business park versus housing, debate. I'm not as concerned about that for some of the reasons that have been stated already. You know, as Drew mentioned, some of that southern parcels don't necessarily have that opportunity. I actually view this as more along the lines of two areas that benefit each other together. So having a place of housing near the transit system and having a place of employment, a substantial business park and expansion that can happen there. To me, those things actually could work hand in hand and be beneficial. And I see some of the amenities and things that are happening in that area, as was mentioned at 40 Parker Street, as being somewhat compatible and beneficial, actually, if you're trying to attract businesses, and folks living here. They're looking for some of those things while they're there and not having to drive somewhere else to get there. So from my view, not necessarily an issue to have a transition of the 40R district or the multifamily housing connecting with the place of employment in this larger area. I definitely appreciate the concerns that were noted. But from my perspective, it's on balance, recognizing what our options are and what the pros and cons are. I'm comfortable with that, and I think it could be a beneficial addition. We haven't talked about this Low Street section yet. I think it could also be a good opportunity at that sort of intersection there. But I'm also interested, to the extent we can get feedback from folks on the 40 Parker Street lot. Although I don't think there's necessarily any reason to want the business to leave there or to think it's going to do so in the near term. I can't help in the back of my mind recognize that there's a whopping number associated with that lot in terms of build out from the state's perspective. So long story short, I guess, is I'm comfortable with the Parker Street extension, so to speak. I have no problem including the 40 Parker myself. And I'm also good with the sort of NPro / Low Street option up here generically as well. Judy?
So, yeah, I just want to point out that the extension of the existing 40R down Parker Street is going to give us more affordable units. So that's a big plus for me.
Meaning, and here you're referring to the fact that, just as a reminder, maybe for others, here where there's an expansion of the 40R district, we have a slight leg up in the sense that it's creating 25% affordable housing units versus the MPro Low Street area would technically be a separate district now under MBTA and would therefore have to be somewhere between 10 and 20% at the higher end. Judy, did you want to add anything else, or that's okay if you don't?
No, that's it.
Okay, thank you. Rick Tainter.
Thanks. Yeah, a couple of things. One is having had a chance to look at the detailed lot by lot information from the spreadsheet. It turns out that at the for the NPro, I'm talking about the NPro area right now, for that area, because the lots on the east side of Route 1 are so small and the way the model works, we get very little benefit from adding those. And it turns out that the area that we've outlined in green doesn't even get us to the 15 units per acre, because you have to include the right of way for Route 1 and Low Street in the denominator. So that area by its, as shown, would not qualify. So the way I'm looking at it is, let's take off the Cottage Court parcels on the east side of Route 1 and tack on some larger lots on the west side, and maybe not even that whole area. I wouldn't include the Timberline, And I wouldn't include that kind of landlocked parcel that's at the bottom right of the orange area.
This one here.
Yeah, that gets
Yeah.
access from Graff Road.
Yeah.
So I would look at those first 2 or 3 parcels that front on Low Street and perhaps pick up the Elks property, which is the upper left corner. And I think we would get enough acreage to get over the 5-acre minimum lot size and have something that's more logical. I mean, jumping across Route 1, we tried to do it because we thought we could get, and I think it was maybe my suggestion, that we thought we could jump across there and pick up those small lots to get enough to get 5 acres. But at the likely densities that we're talking about, we might not even qualify the area for an MBTA district. So I'd like to look a little bit more at that area and try to take some of Bob's recommendation and pull in some of that area that fronts on Low Street, but not go as deep into the industrial park or into the business park as the orange outline would show. On the southern side, I look
I'm
at.
sorry, Rick,
Yeah.
if I could just interject, so just to make clear, so the parcels that you would include in that scenario, because he and I had talked about running that scenario. We haven't got it from him yet, but this piece right here, this piece.
Which I'm not seeing what you're showing.
Oh, sorry, are you not? Sorry. You able to see that now?
Yeah, I see that, yeah.
Okay. So this you in your scenario would be this parcel, and this parcel.
Yeah, and just cut across the driveway, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Sorry. Feel free to go on. I just want to make sure folks had that in mind.
So then down on the Parker Street side, I look at the entrance to, the Boston Way. We've got housing, and we actually heard a lot of these same concerns when we did the 40R district. Some neighbors, business neighbors, thought that the housing would be negative in the 40R district, and I get that. I get that this kind of creeping, as Councilor Shan said, erosion of the district. But I look at the Boston Way corner, and we've got a big residential property facing on Boston Way and Parker. So to me, the opposite corner, having housing facing housing, actually makes a lot of sense. So that one I could easily pick up. And I don't have a lot of concern about the next 2 parcels. I guess I might not try to go any further than those 2 and just take those 3 parcels and pick them up and look at them, because it's not getting really into the business park. And it as you noted, we have, a great attraction for people with Riverwalk and Metro Rock. So this really makes it a multi-use center, and it makes much more sense to me than trying to separate things entirely. So I would maybe do that small expansion down on the south side, and then look at those Low Street parcels and see if we could cobble together enough parcels to get over the line, get over the goalpost. And then getting back to the Enpro site, one of the problems we have if we were looking even further into the Back Bay area is those parcels aren't going to get us anything really. The parcels are so small, the models, when you look at setbacks and everything, it's going to be very hard to get 3-unit buildings in there, even 3-unit buildings. We can get, if we try to get any more multifamily in there, it's going to be a big push to get a lot of parcels to get a very small increment in unit capacity.
And Rick, what you're getting at there is that's akin to the cemetery in the sense that it penalizes us in a way to try to include an area of that size with those small lots.
And you're adding that street surface to the denominator, all those individual residential streets to the denominator. So it just brings down, you really have to work really hard to get over the 15 unit per acre minimum.
Thank you. Ian, did you want to speak to that?
Yeah, just a couple of things there. Thanks very much, Rick, for your comments. So you had the right observation about those small parcels on the MPRO that they aren't modeling anything. The main reason for that right now is because they're considered non-conforming lots if we assume a 10,000 square foot lot minimum. And so if anybody wanted to renovate that, then it would not be by right, which is why it's not considered modeling anything. If in your eventual bylaw, if you entertain a lower minimum lot size, then those would add unit capacity to your modeling. And so you do have that option. I will also add that it is okay if a sub-district like this one at MPRO is below 15 units an acre, as long as all of your sub-districts together average out to above 15 units an acre. So you can have some sub-districts that are 10 units an acre, as long as your other one is 20 units an acre, and they average out to 15. And then the last comment I wanted to make was on those low street parcels, you would not be able to skip over the driveway. HLC would likely consider that not contiguous. I had a similar situation in a different community where we wanted to skip over. Really, that was just an access point on one parcel, and I was informed that would be considered non-contiguous. So if you skip over that driveway, you have to make up 5 acres on the other side of it.
And Ian, and again, I defer to you on that because you've had a little bit more discussion with the folks from the state. But I know in the actual guidelines that they have provided, there is the ability to present a case to them as to why you think there's a rationale for including only a portion of a parcel or whatnot. I definitely agree from the mapping contiguity issue. But I'm wondering here, your sense is that they would not. I know, I think I spoke to this previously about the Kmart site having an issue like that. I don't think the state would, for instance, have looked at a parcel like that and said it makes sense to divide it up in terms of zoning. And your sense here is that they would not allow us to treat that as a contiguous district, with that even though it's functioning as just a driveway, they would not allow us to use that other parcel, the Elks parcel.
Yeah, the case we tried to make in another community, they had 2 parcels next to, or they had 2 parcels split by a driveway, and the driveway was giving access to a gigantic 30-acre parcel roughly behind the 2 parcels we wanted to zone. And so we were like, we don't want the giant 30-acre parcel, we just want these 2, and they're only split by this driveway access point, and they said no to that. So I would assume if they said no to that.
So Ian, one question with that, and again, I not to dispute it, just a question. I don't know whether the rationale in that scenario happened to include the fact that this is characteristically potentially different land. I don't know whether or not what that scenario had there, whether or not the assumption is that if housing is happening by the streetscape, that keeping industrial land sort of at the back as part of a larger chunk, that, I don't know whether or not perhaps here they would still not look at that, but I'm wondering if they would take an explanation that this is actually functioning already as part of that back industrial land, and perhaps maybe shouldn't be treated the same as the frontage. But at the end of the day, we're still subject to their approval, which, as we've discussed, and we'll see in a minute with our chart, is one of the criteria, the sort of hassle with, for lack of a better term, of trying to ensure the state will approve what we propose. That is one of the factors that we're considering, is the likelihood of them approving it. So.
Yeah, I mean, to be safe, you would want to grab both parcels on the other side of that driveway that abut what Henry Graff Road there. So
Yeah.
you take the corner one, that would get you to 5 acres. And they might, like you said, they might review it and say that you can exclude that driveway and be fine. I would err on the side of caution and say they won't.
It's certainly not an obvious thumbs up, right? Is what you're saying.
Right, correct.
So Ian, is I understand the 5-acre minimum. And I understand the contiguity requirement. I have not, and you can show, you know a lot more about this than I do. So I could not find, or I did not see anything in the guidelines that said that you could not, cut off part of a parcel. So you're saying that that's in the guidelines?
I can pull it up for you. It's actually in a separate document that they have posted with all the requirements. It's actually in a separate PDF, which is why you might not have seen it.
It's not in the guidelines itself. It's something
It's
else.
in a separate document that deals with the district contiguity, I think. But I can pull that up if you want.
Yeah, it's there's pages and pages if you'd like to read the state's documentation. There's the compliance model user guide is what Andy is referencing, and that breaks down how to map parcels in the compliance model and what is allowed and what is not allowed. And so in that they talk about splitting parcels and how they prefer communities. Well, they really say don't split parcels. If you absolutely have to split a parcel, talk to us and we'll figure out how to do it with you.
Okay. Well, I understand that. So that's from the point of view of the compliance model, but you're saying that they could not, in terms of the guidelines, that this supersedes the guidelines, in other words, or it adds to the guidelines.
It supplements it. And I think the question here is we would have to check with them to see whether or not they would accept our argument in order to, one, and they'd have to explain how they'd want us to, adjust the model. But we'd also have to make sure that they're in agreement at the end of the day that it does not violate this rule without a good rationale, I guess, for them to give an exception.
I think this is something that if other members of the group agreed, I think this is something that we should really push hard on because it's actually very illogical to, I mean, it's logical from the point of view is in that it's making the GIS analysis drive your local planning. And I think we should have our local planning be the driver rather than some technical requirement.
Yeah, and I can't say frankly that I disagree with that. I'm a little bit mixed on how important it is to go back and forth over that if there was sort of an obvious stop with the state, in part because I see that we have some potential with places like Parker Street, but defer to the rest of the discussion.
Yeah, my sense is if there's concern about Parker Street and we can resolve or address partially that concern by doing something on Low Street, then I would think it would be in the community's interest to push on it.
Yeah.
And I
Thank
have
you.
heard of
I
other
agree with
communities that are
conceptually, it
doing it.
doesn't.
So
Yeah, sorry.
I just wanted to say I have heard of other communities that have gone through the process with the state. I don't know what the final outcome was, but it's certainly worthwhile if you want to bring it up. They will entertain your comments.
So Ian, as we're taking notes on this, the questions that I wanted to follow up with you after this meeting on some of these, but the questions we have for the state, I think we should include in that, obviously, this scenario here. I agree with Rick's notion relative to proper land use planning versus, arbitrary sort of guidelines or GIS analysis. At the end of the day, if the state won't approve it, we know where we are, but I do think it's worth asking. So thank you. Jennifer, you had your hand raised first.
Yes, I'm not sure it's relevant to exactly what you're speaking of now, but there was some mention of that Back Bay neighborhood. And when Ian referenced that they would be considered non-conforming, would the fact also that they have historic homes on them that would require a different demo delay process in order to actually develop the parcel eliminate them as possible lots to be considered?
Is there a historic overlay district there?
We have an overlay over our entire city that says anything 75 years or older must be considered for demolition delay. And that happens to be a neighborhood that has quite a few single and two family homes that are greater than 75 years old.
I think the only assessment from the state side would be, is that demolition, with the demolition delay, is it still considered by right? I mean, do they have to get a special permit for that and what that process looks like? I think you need to talk to the state about what they consider for that. I don't know the answer to it off the top of my head.
So we could add that, right, to our list of questions. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if we think that that's a viable neighborhood, if it, like I said, it may not be viable if it is just not viable for other reasons.
I think we're still, at the end of the day, probably talking about the same question, which is the fact that a special permit would be needed for some of this stuff, right? And the question ultimately for the state is this really as of right multifamily, right?
Right, and I think
Right,
it's pretty clear that it would not be as of right, so I think, so you'd have to remove those parcels from the demolition control overlay district.
Right, right. Which is a very different discussion than some of these other areas we've been talking about, don't have those types of contextual issues. Jennifer, did you want to add anything else to that, or?
No, I think I just wanted to raise it, and if Ian doesn't have the answer, we'll should we land with those, any parcel that has a structure on it like that, we'll just have to get the answer.
Yeah, we'll add it to our list. We'll ask the state.
Councilor Shan?
Actually, Drew Shapiro's next and then Councilor Shan.
Okay, yeah.
Yep.
go ahead.
Sorry.
I'll keep it super brief. I was just going to say in response to what Rick was talking about with respect to the parcel splitting issue. I think some of you guys are aware that I am leading this process in another community. And, we were contending with this issue as well. And we ultimately decided that we decided not to work with the state and keep it really simple and just take whole parcels. And we did it, in a way where we wanted to be closer to that 50 acre. We were required to do 50 acres. We have a lower requirement here in Newburyport. And we have close to 93 acres because we're using two parcels that are quite a bit larger in size than we would have ordinarily wanted to see it zoned for. Anyway, that's not all to say that we shouldn't pursue a process with the state. I'm just letting you guys know that, I think other communities have probably done this calculus as well and decided you know, given the timelines and given all the risk and trying to go back and forth, that, you know, maybe it's just good to leave well enough alone and see if you can find whole parcels that meet your needs, which is something we did in the community that I work in.
Thanks, Drew. Councilor Shannon?
I would just want to go back to the Inpro extension and what Rick was talking about earlier. How do you need all 4 of those parcels, Rick, to get to the 5 acres? I'm sorry, I wasn't.
No, I don't think you do. I guess it's kind of a balancing act, how much you take off the east side and add back in on the west side. But it might be possible to just take those first 2 parcels up to the driveway to Timberline and add that to the Enpro parcel. And you're getting more, because you're including a big parcel. The first parcel is very large and is not completely developable, but it's much larger than what you're taking away on the east side. So I think we could easily do that. I mean, taking Drew's recommendation in terms of whether to keep it simple and not fight the battle that makes sense to us. I think we could just do it on that side and get what we need.
Thank you, Rick. And Ian obviously would have to run through the model again just to make sure these other parameters, it's because there's so many different parameters overlapping each other. We'd obviously want to run the model again to just verify that we don't run into any other snags there doing that configuration.
Okay.
Ian, feel free to chime in at any point if you have any thoughts on these scenarios.
Yeah, the one other comment that I'll make as folks are discussing is it'd be great if anybody has an inkling towards what dimensional parameters you want to use. It's relatively easy for us to plug in parcels and run it again and see how it comes out. It gets complicated when we want to test multiple different scenarios with different densities and different height limits. And so if folks are gravitating towards this NPro and Low Street area being on the 3-story height limit, 30 units an acre, 3-story height limit, 20 units an acre, whatever that is, I think that would be helpful to know, because that would definitely ramp up our productivity and being able to get you a lot more answers on a lot more parcels.
Yeah. My sense is we're really talking about 35 feet, you know, on the 38 units an acre kind of spectrum or smaller, but that's my sense. Jennifer, you have your hand raised. Jennifer, you're on mute. You have your hand raised though. Did you want to address the group? No.
I do not intend to have my hand raised. I don't see it raised.
Okay. All right. I'll lower it for you. No problem. Okay. Councilor Shannon.
So we have, maybe I missed it earlier and I apologize for not being here last week. The Hines Way, wasn't there a section that we were talking about including on the right side? Was there an issue there? The cemetery?
Yes, it's a similar sort, not exactly the same issue. And Ian, feel free to chime on this, but it's a similar issue in that essentially we have to go back and forth with the state and they have to correct the model, the data sets we're using to run it through the model, just to get whatever I forget off the top of my head the number of units over there, but just to do that. And it goes to Drew's point. Again, I defer to the collective decision, but my sense is that's probably not worth one worth bothering with if we can, make up the difference elsewhere. Just on the whole, I have to consider all different factors. And I know that most people in this group do not have to deal with the exchange with the state to try to resolve issues like this. But the Hines Way one has a data error in the data sets that are being used. And so it's treated right now as land that we can't use. Ian, did you want to speak to that at all? Again, I don't have any horse in the race on that one. I'm fine including it, but I do also see that as one of those snags that Drew was referencing. So.
I do have to look, unless you know off the top of your head, Andy, what is the data error with it? Is it the size of the parcel or the use of the parcel?
The use of the parcel. The state is still seeing that as cemetery land on one of the layers. They have the parcel definition is defined correctly, but the opens, when they do their overlays and they extract data or allowances, they were picking up on the idea of that being cemetery land because the open space layer isn't corrected yet. So.
That's a relatively, I shouldn't say easy, but it's easier to make that change with the state than everything else we're talking about here. And so what you do essentially when you fill out your application is you say if you changed any parcels in the compliance model and why you changed them. And as long as there's no conservation restriction on that land that still exists or something to that extent, we can just say that it has since changed. It's no longer open space or whatever it used to be. It's not too difficult to do that.
So thanks, Ian. So I think we'll want to confer with the state on that as part of our upcoming list, and if they're on the same page about that, I think we should plan on trying to do that. But let's verify, like you said, that it's relatively straightforward.
Thank
Sorry,
you.
Rick. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
So I was going to ask again about Heinz Way. Ian, the last time we saw numbers about this, we just saw a single number, but we didn't see the lower number that you've done for these other parcels. Have you run that as well to look at that, or is that you haven't gone back to look at Heinz Way again?
Heinz Way I did not, because I think there was, I remember some feedback from the last meeting about folks weren't sure if they wanted it, and there was some indecisiveness around the group if they wanted Heinz Way or not. I can do it, and it's straightforward, but
And
I
my
think
other
there was some
question,
indecisiveness.
and my other question about that is, it's not clear to me whether this parcel is the Heinz Way parcel is a U-shaped parcel wrapping around Heinz Way, or whether Heinz Way is a private driveway that is incorporated in the whole parcel. When we look at it on an assessor's map, it seems to be a U-shaped parcel rather than a more.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Rick. Ian, when we talk with the state, we should discuss that as well, because in fact, I think Rick is right that should be treated as a more or less rectangular parcel, so to speak, as opposed to having, it's actually not a way, but rather a driveway going through there. And so it's perhaps understandable to a degree why they're sort of showing it that way, but I think it needs to be corrected to treat it as a whole parcel with these multiple units on it. But I don't know if you want to speak to that, given what you can see.
No, I think you're right. I think we have to look into that because you'd have to include that land area.
Yeah. Sorry, Madeline.
Thanks, Andy. When we met last week, I thought we said that Heinz Way didn't really make sense because it's recently been developed with housing.
That was, oh, thank you, Madeline. Yeah, that was back to the discussion we were gonna pick up on, which is the ranking and the reasons for using one area versus another. That gets back in that discussion about whether or not we're trying to check a box and say we've met an area versus are we making the potential for any housing units here. We wouldn't necessarily be creating any new housing units, but we'd be getting credit under MBTA. And as you're noting, this would not necessarily produce housing units that are in need.
Yeah, and I mean, I feel that would also be true for the cottage court area. I mean, these seem to be small sections that, have had recent residential development on them. It just, to me, it sort of seems areas we're talking about look like they have some development potential. So I don't know, it just seems kind of a waste of time to consider them. Just saying, that's my sense of it.
Thank you. Madeline, do you have any thoughts on any other options or that we've just discussed, or?
Well, I mean, I think the Low Street area makes sense to me. I also agree with Judy's comment that there's a real benefit to being adjacent to the 40R and getting the 25% affordable, which is part of the reason why I think the Parker Street areas are of great interest. And I just have a question about the NPRO area and I think I asked this last time we met about, are there development constraints there? I just don't know enough about it, but it does seem like it's ripe for development.
Sorry, when you say development constraints, I mean,
well, I guess I'm wondering about environmental,
to our knowledge, there are not cleanup issues there. And it's, in terms of hazmat or whatnot, to our understanding, that's not the case. But there aren't obviously any wetlands or whatnot in that area.
Right,
so.
right. Okay, that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to try to
Alden?
yeah, there we go. Never mind.
Alden?
Yeah, hi.
Actually, sorry, Chris was first. Sorry, I could see the order.
Oh,
So
sorry.
Chris Carney.
If you want to be the police, Rose,
Yeah.
I don't have a problem. Sorry, I didn't mean to. If Chris had his hand raised first.
Yeah, Chris and then Alden.
Hi, how you guys doing? Yeah, so thank you. I just wanted to comment, if the intent of the law is really to create housing kind of around an MBTA station, that seems like that's what Heinz Way is. I don't know why we wouldn't consider taking credit for it. It's kind of like you almost need to, you know, get rid of the development area on One Boston Way, if under that logic. I don't know. So I think it's, I don't know, that's kind of my view on it. It's like, just from the resident standpoint, you're like, wait, we built a bunch of places that are right near the MBTA community or MBTA station. I don't know, why not take credit for that? Because then it kind of balances out. Like out here, like, okay, well, we don't want to, you know, impinge upon the industrial park too much, you know. So so that's one way to kind of balance that out and try to not do that to the extent that we don't have to. One other thing, well, that's just the most relevant comment, I think, to the discussion. I have some thoughts for later in the discussion, but that was my thinking.
Yeah, thank you. Chris, if you happen to have any other thoughts on the other district mapping options or scenarios, feel free to chime in that now, just so folks have that in mind as well, if there are any.
No, mine's more of like a little bit of a messaging thing for the just general public for like kind of this whole effort. So it's not a direct comments on any of those other districts. I mean, there was one, just my thought, like, I think the Inpro site, someone initially said, like, well, how come that hasn't been developed? And it's because there isn't really great access, because you can kind of go in only in one way and out one way. So like, you know, if you're kind of taking that argument of like, all right, we really want to do sites where people will actually build, you know, will that be a blocker for a developer to have us, you know, multiple units in there where there's literally one way in, one way out? I don't know. So just a question. Some of you guys are more experienced than me.
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't actually think that's the issue here. I think actually it's more problematic. There was a discussion about it at one point, and the landowner was positing the idea of doing a bunch of commercial and a hotel and whatnot. I think the commercial uses would be probably more problematic and problems with marketing than, say, residential, because it does not generating a whole lot of traffic sort of throughout the day. But you know, my sense is that it is not necessarily a hurdle for someone to develop that for residential, but is more questionable as to whether that makes any sense to do it, you know, for commercial or traffic generating uses.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Alden.
Yeah, hi. Just to follow up on Chris's point, I think my thought originally always was if we get some bump out of including the Hines Way area, I thought that would be worthwhile potentially. The other comment with the Empro site as far as access, the Haley site there that's being developed has some of that same issue with that is being developed with access in one way and out one way. So just as a separate note. My main question was is there a concern with the connectivity to the Low Street section from the Empro because of the lot that's the B&M lot that we would be bridging? Is that a concern?
We're really talking about rail trail here, so I think that's Ian, correct me if I'm wrong, but I see that as the same as the roadway for the purpose of connectivity or contiguity in the MBTA. Is that your sense?
Yep, any right of way can be used to connect to districts.
Okay, just wanted to make sure, there wasn't a concern. Thanks.
I'm sorry, Heath?
Yeah, Andy, is there a reason we haven't focused on the Pond Street CVS lot? Is that lot not the proper acreage size? I'm just curious. It seems like a very large section that we're not really discussing regularly.
Well, Councilor McCauley had suggested actually making a connection from the 40R district up to and grabbing the CVS parcel. And if you put these aside for a minute, then we're back into a discussion about whether or not the CVS parcel is to be done as presumably a separate district, and does it include something else? I don't know that that's 5 acres by itself. So at the end of the day, I guess folks might have other thoughts on that, including Ian. But there was a suggestion or the thought thrown out about doing that. Perhaps you're thinking of something smaller than that. I think the main thing would be, does the total district that we're defining over there create 5 acres, and then taking it from there to see the other parameters? Ian, did you want to add anything to that or modify that at all?
No, you're right.
Okay, sorry, Heath, did you ever want to ask anything else or chime in with any other thoughts before I go to the next?
No, I was just curious why we haven't really focused on that.
Got it.
That was- that-
Do you happen to
yeah.
have, if you happen to have a thought about if that parcel is, I don't know how many acres that is off the top of my head, but if that were
It's not
enlarged
5
or-
acres. I just took a look. It's
Yeah.
2
No,
point
it-
something.
2.4.
We're back into a similar discussion about whether or not we're including some adjacent parcels, and if so, what configuration or lots make sense, to the point that Rick had made earlier. So,
I see. Yeah, that definitely changes that area, or potentially using that area for sure.
yeah, and part of this comes back to the various different, requirements, one of which is that you can't count any area unless it's part of a 5 acre sort of minimum smaller district, so.
Right.
Sorry, Chris, you had your hand raised?
I don't think it
Chris,
ever went down.
Do I? Oh, I don't intend to. If I did, I'm sorry.
okay, no worries. That's all right. Madeline?
Yeah, I was just gonna piggyback on what Heath raised about the CBS site. I just wanted to mention that it was included in our housing production plan, not the one that we're working on today, but the one that still is in force, where it seemed like a great opportunity for creating mixed use with commercial on the ground floor and housing above. So, just throwing that out there, I hear that it's not 5 acres, but, I don't know whether some additional land could be added to it to make it comply. I just thought I'd mention.
No, that's a great comment. I would note, and just if it helps at all, just because it's not included in MBTA submission, if it's not, that does not preclude us from rezoning it or having development of that nature happen there. It's just a question of whether or not that area be included. So if there's concern about expanding to make a larger 5 acre area over there, that doesn't mean that we wouldn't be able to either rezone it or allow development of that nature to happen without MBTA communities, so to speak. Beth?
No, just about that too. If it really looks ripe for mixed use, MBTA is not the best way to do that, right? Because you can't require mixed use.
Yeah, if we want to encourage the mixed use,
Okay.
I would say not doing MBTA is preferable. Yeah. Anyone else have any other thoughts or questions? I think, for now, having as much feedback as possible on the alternatives that have been placed out there, hearing whether or not anybody has any remaining interest in looking at Story Ave Low, if we're able to sort of close the discussion there. At the end of the day, there would not be need to revisit anything over there if we're able to settle on balance here, the totality of the total unit count needed. But in order to get there, I think the most important thing, we're sort of recognizing it's 5:45 right now, and we were sort of planning on wrapping up at 6. My biggest concern is that we give to the Office of Planning and Development as a group, and also to Ian, any particular scenarios we want to run through the system. Ian and I have been taking notes, and we're seeing the options that have been discussed just now. But are there any other variations on this that folks want to see, so we can make sure that those are run through and circle back with us in terms of the actual counts? Sorry, Councilor Khan, you raise your hand.
Well, I guess I think what you were saying is what I was thinking. So the next step is we have these areas that you've identified right here, what we're looking at, and that Ian's going to run the capacity units, and we look at that and then pull out what we don't think we need. So
Right.
now you're asking, do we want to add anything else? Are we okay with what we have here?
Yes, exactly. And one of the things I was thinking, and chime in anyone if you wanted this, my biggest concern as I've been seeing the options thrown around is we have seen a couple of variations of the lots on Parker Street. So if there's any other, possible configuration or variation of these things, making sure that we give, that information to Ian so we can run it through the complete model and see what the numbers come out at the end of the day for those overall areas. I just want to make sure we include any of that. And it could be around the Emperor site, it could be the Parker Street section, it could be something else, but we want to make sure we run it through the system if it's an option that folks are really seriously considering us moving forward with. So, sorry, I didn't see who raised their hand first, but Councilor McCauley.
Macaulay, yeah, Jim Macaulay.
Yeah, I just have a quick question. It was alluded to in these discussions that there's a spreadsheet floating around that has the parcel unit count. Is that something that can be shared with this group? So we might be able to do some noodling on our own and then come back with maybe some variations that you're looking for?
Yeah, it can. And I can display a little bit of a snapshot of that. But Ian, did you want to speak to that? I think it would be important. I guess my first reaction to that is to say, yes, we can post that. We can make it available. It's important, I think, to understand what that data is and which columns or cells you'd be pulling data from. And this goes to how complicated the modeling system is. But I'm happy to show the table or reference it. But Ian, I think the biggest thing here would be, as folks want to noodle around with it, just understanding which cells they're pulling their data from for the unit counts. We have two different cells that have been used to create the range based on the model, and they could pull that from the table. I'm happy to show that. Did you have any other thoughts on that?
Yeah.
No, what
hold
I'd
on.
like to, oh, sorry.
I just want to clarify. I'm not looking to do my own, use of the tool. I was under the impression from listening that we've already done some of those, and we only see bits and pieces of them, right? So if they're already done and they're static and can be in PDF, I'm okay with that too. I'm just, however you want to approach it. Thanks.
Sure.
Yep, I can do that. What we'll do is we'll simplify what we have, just bring it to just the unit capacity kind of column. We'll pull that out, and then noting that it is going to be a range, as we talked about at the beginning, there's going to be kind of a minimum and maximum column along with each parcel.
Thank you. And then as you can see in those groupings, you could then select certain parcels within there. You'll have to keep in mind, if you're selecting parcels out of that grouping, for instance, recognizing that we're still back to the same criteria about contiguity of district and so forth. So we'll still have to keep in mind the overlapping parameters, but you'll be able to, pull that range from each of the individual parcels and sort of add it, to see if you want to get to a different place on that. Councilor Sheehan?
Thanks. So if I think I'm going to repeat something that Rick said, but if we can just do the 3 on Parker Street and not include jumping across to the old Strom place.
Okay, right. So
That's
that's just
one.
these 3 here. Yeah.
Just those 3. And
Yep.
then what we were talking about on Low Street, using the Impro site, and then the first 2 on the orange section to make it a long stretch.
This
And then,
year. Yep.
yeah, and then including Hines Way, and then figure out how to get the state to accept the land behind it. Those would be my 3 asks.
Okay, thank you. We will definitely do that. Ian, I'd like to include when we discuss that with the state, and I don't know if you're able to, in the meantime, we're sort of in parallel with our discussion with the state on the Hines Way area, if we could actually run it as if it's one parcel, recognize, sort of not treating, we don't have to create a parcel there, but to correct that, what they're showing as a right of way to just be a driveway. And that way we're actually running it the way that it would come out, so we can circle back with this group and give a more definitive number. We'd have to obviously confer with the state on that question, but assuming that they do make both of those corrections about it being unavailable or it having a roadway in it, I think it would make sense to rectify both of those and then be able to circle back with this group with a number, because if folks are looking to that to be included, we'd be able to also give a number that's more correct, because I don't think the right of way, the way it's drawn in there, would be a correct interpretation of that lot. Okay, Beth?
Oh, you know what? Sorry, Heather took the words right out of my mouth about Parker Street and Low Street, which
Oh,
ones to
okay.
include. So I put my hand down now.
Okay. Thank you. Rick?
Yeah, a couple of things. One, on the Hines Way parcel. When I drew that outline around the Hines Way, I pulled it across Parker Street to get the frontage of that lot that's there that has some potential. But I think you're really talking about just the Hines Way parcel itself, correct?
That's my understanding. Councilor Shan, is that safe to say with your understanding as well, and Beth?
Right. I
Yeah.
just want us to make sure that whatever issues we have with the state right now, we get it resolved. And if Chris thinks
Yeah.
it's easy enough, then I think we should do that. And then
Okay.
if there is an opportunity to use something across the street, Rick, I mean, go for it.
Right. Well, I'm not sure there is, but I think the problem is that when you get across the street, you have to take in the right of way of Parker Street, which again lowers your density for the, so it doesn't.
Okay.
help that much.
Yeah,
Well,
I wouldn't include it myself. Yeah.
And to
Okay,
that-
well, I
yeah.
just want that back section let's get that resolved with the state now.
And to this, a similar point on the Enpro site, as we get rid of the east side, I think we're agreed to get rid of the east side of Route 1, which helps us a lot because it gets rid of all the right of way in Route 1. But when we draw when we come up with the new list of parcels for the NPRO area, including a couple of parcels on Low Street. I assume, Ian, you're going to be doing a similar thing as you did before, which is to create a spreadsheet with the parcels we're looking at, which will show us the area of the parcels. Is it possible when you're doing that to pull in, I think we'll only have a very small section of right-of-way of Low Street that we need to worry about, but is it possible to estimate that area so we know what the total area of the district is?
Yes. Yeah, I wouldn't say specifically the right-of-way area, but I can give you the total area, including the right-of-way.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Does anybody have any other thoughts on the maps or the options, or even, and because it is actually relevant to the modeling, any of the, we've been working off of the same sort of density parameters that are in the 40R district, with the exception of we've added the 20 units per acre because of the tapering off to another neighborhood. So does anybody have any other thoughts on that? Because that does go back to the modeling and it has a bearing on the numbers that we get at the end of the day. So are folks still comfortable with what we're assuming there, the 20 to 30 units an acre for, say, the MPRO area, and 30 to 40 units an acre for modeling this area?
Yeah, I could speak on that. I do like keeping it less, yeah, so the area by Low Street and not having that be so densely populated. And I think that's our 40R. I know we have the A and B type of scenario. So I'm very content. I think we agreed that last time. And then by Parker, similar to what's there in terms of that density, I'm definitely in favor in keeping that.
Okay. Thank you. And I would just note for the record, and feel free to chime in if anybody wants to, the Hines Way area, I'm assuming here for all intents and purposes that this is sub-district B of the 40R is right up in here. And my assumption is that we would extend that, and this would therefore be a 30 unit an acre expansion on that, unless somebody's thinking something different. I'm assuming that's what Ian would be modeling with that one.
I'm okay with that.
Okay.
And to that point, Andy, the Parker Street parcels, because those are adjacent to the 40RA district.
Yeah.
Should we go ahead with modeling those at 40 units an acre as the A is in 40R? Or are folks still wanting to entertain that being at 30 units an acre, equivalent to the Hines Way area?
Right. I'll say for myself, I'm perfectly comfortable with the 40 units an acre. But if folks are interested in seeing the 30 units per acre scenario and the lower count that would produce to see where it aligns us, I have no problem with that. I'm myself am perfectly fine with the 40 units for that area. So I'm not bothered if we don't do the 30 units run. Sorry, go ahead. Rick, you had a thought on that?
Yeah, I was going to say, I agree with you on that. And just to assuage any concerns, I believe that even though it's the same density, I believe the height limit is lower than the height limit that applies on Boston Way. Is that correct?
That's right. It's only 4 stories. You cannot do 5 stories there. So I guess the question would be, does anybody here feel we need to run 30 units an acre on that Parker Street section, or are we all putting aside for a minute whether or not there's any extension of that area? If it was extended, does anybody have a feeling of running 30 units an acre versus just the 40?
Andy, just throwing it out here, isn't it just smart just to have all the numbers, just to, whether we do 30 or 40 acres a unit, just to have all the numbers so we could be able to compare and contrast?
Yeah, again, I have no problem with that. I would just sort of balancing act between, what people are actually want to spend time on and all the sort of effort that has to go on in between each scenario we run. So again, I definitely agree with that notion. I'm clarifying, at least I wasn't as concerned about that one. So if I was just going to say, if no one else was really interested in that one at all, it might not make any sense for Ian to run that through the modeling. But if there is interest, like you said, then we do that and we see where that number ends up being. It'll be somewhat lower, whatever that number is, but it'll give us an indication as to whether or not 30 units an acre would reach that threshold versus, say, going to 40. So
I gotcha. Thank you.
That's fair.
Ian,
Makes sense.
Right. Yeah. Okay, so Ian, do you mind running 30 units an acre on that as well, just so that we can see where that puts us on that one?
Yeah.
Okay. When
does this group meet again? It's not next week, right? I don't have it on my.
I think it skips next week, and I believe it's the 18th.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Any other last thoughts on the maps? hopefully we've given everything, it's one of those things that could go on indefinitely depending on how many variations we do. So hopefully as we come back and we look at these other scenarios, the variations and the new counts, hopefully we'll be able to hone in on something. I think the assumption here is that somewhere between these two combinations, so to speak, or three, let's say, combinations of expansions of 40R or a new MPRO style area, that we're not really looking elsewhere in the city. So for now, unless something were to drastically change, I think we're really honing in now on these and trying to get to that total unit capacity in the arrangement that makes the most sense. So please keep considering these areas, and we'll run through, circle back with the updated data to follow these sketches for the areas, and then pick up the discussion. We'll obviously parallel that with the City Council Planning and Development Committee and Planning Board, but we're hoping in the next couple of weeks to make a decision as to where we want to do this. So, sorry, Beth, you raised your hand?
I did. I just wanted to, this is not necessarily about parcels, but just thinking ahead. If we are really serious about this NPRO Low Street thing, which seems like it's really fruitful, at what point do we need to like really move forward with working on getting that study and permission to have this be 20% affordable? If do you know what I mean? Like, if we want to do that, I just want to make sure that that's in our minds, so we're getting the ball rolling, so that we're not stuck with 10 or whatever, that we can really maximize that. Because I feel like that's like a good faith trade-off of like, okay, we're saying we're not going to encroach on the industrial part, even though that would get us a lot of affordability. So let's really push to make sure that we can maximize it in that Low Street and Pro section.
That's a great question. So Ian at MVPC is also helping us with the economic feasibility analysis, or EFA. So Ian can speak to that timeline and schedule there, but we're really going to be able to kind of parallel that a bit. I think for generic assumptions right now, we're going on the same parameters for this area, but it was noted, Rick had noted at the planning board meeting last night, one thing we have to consider for this other area is the 40R district is a self-contained district, so it has all the parameters established in it. That's something that the state wanted with 40R. Here, because this new district would not be part of the 40R, we have to look at other definitions and provisions in the zoning that might impact the way that the state looks at the district there. So we would be starting this, this mapping of the district and the unit count with the assumption that we're basing it on the sort of 40R style format, if you will, for density calculations. But at the end of the day, if we were to toggle with that, and the reason I mentioned that this isn't a factor is similar on the affordable housing side of it. If we have a 3-story allowance or 35-foot height, and a 30 units an acre or 20 units an acre, that's going to have a bearing on whether or not the state sees the economic feasibility for a developer. If it's taller buildings and more units, they're going to say it's easier to get to a higher percentage of affordable units in that project. So at the end of the day, it's a bit iterative, but I think here, if we're on the assumption that it's somewhere either 20 units an acre or 30, and I'm fine with 30 myself, but if it was one of those, then the EFA is going to be essentially what it is, meaning we run through the model and it's going to produce something at that volume on the site. It's going to produce a certain percentage of affordable housing that the state will say is acceptable. If we increase that to 40 units an acre, a higher density, that would increase presumably the affordable housing percentage that the state would consider viable above 10%, never going above 20. So Ian, did you want to offer any thoughts on that? I know we're going to be working in parallel on this, but to that point that Beth raised, right now we're making some broad brush assumptions that it's paralleling, with the 40R area, but any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'd say we are targeting the end of April for that analysis, and that it will be dependent on what the group decides on those dimensional parameters in that district. And so once you decide on height and density caps, that will affect the EFA. So we'll want to incorporate that. We are also going to be looking at, I believe, 20% and 15%. I will say, spoiler alert, as we've been looking at some other communities, it's tough. The 20% has been tough to prove feasibility for. And so it varies very much by community, but we are going to be looking at 15 and 20. And I'm more optimistic about 15% than I am about 20%, to be quite honest.
I tend to agree with that. I think it's unfortunate. We've talked about before the percentages and the cap here at 20. I tend to agree that that's probably where we'll end up with this. And that's why I just, if nothing else, I didn't want folks to get their hopes up too much that we would get to 20% with, say, the MPRO area, only because of the balancing act. You'd have to have a scale that the community then may feel like is out of scale at that location in order to achieve a 20% affordable housing requirement. So it's a balance between multiple variables.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we didn't get to cover everything that we wanted to do on our agenda, and I apologize for that, especially to Rick. Rick was going to cover some ground that we talked about with the planning board a little bit last night. We can obviously pick on some of that at our next meeting. Rick, did you want to talk about that at all or speak to that, or I apologize.
I don't, I think, I don't want to take us past too much past 6. The point I wanted to make though was that looking at this map, a good chunk of our effort is around noodling around the edges of the existing smart growth district. And that means we don't have to do a lot of work on the regulations for that, because it's all, as you mentioned, it's all self-contained. So we're really on 2 different tracks here. I'm thinking back to the summary timeline, and I think you and I should probably sit down and look at that timeline again and figure out how it changes, because it actually makes things much simpler to say we don't have to do much around the 40R district. We're just going to be working around the edges of it. And if we work on the NPRO district, and we'll have to think in more detail about what kind of zoning regulations, but it's not as complicated as it would have been had we been looking at Story Avenue and Low Street. So I think
I agree with that notion. Story Avenue is another whole beast. I will say though, I think that comparatively to your exact point, Parker Street, for instance, or Hines Way being expansions right off the 40R and working at that same framework, there's definitely a lot more discussion that has to happen and tweaking and working that has to be done on the zoning to make this district work for MBTA, because it's not building off of the 40R. It's now a standalone district of its own. So that will take some more meetings and more discussions in order to sort that out. Similar to the Story Avenue discussion, not quite as big, of course, but similar to that in a way. So. Okay, so I guess I don't want to. I would be happy to stay myself for more discussion, but I want to recognize people's time. An hour and a half at each of these meetings is a lot. So I appreciate everybody patching in. Our next meeting is going to be on the 18th. We'll see what we get, from me and MVPC on the calculations. We'll distribute anything we can beforehand. We'll go over that at the meeting. There are a couple of meetings that are happening between now and then. I'm sure that the Councilor Shan will report out to the City Council on the 8th about where we are. The 16th, there's a Planning and Development Committee meeting, so I assume we'll give an update there and check in depending on where we are. And the Planning Board on the 17th, but we'll be meeting back again as the ZAG on the 18th. So I think our, as I put it on our agenda, the main thing is really to finalize this MBTA communities component. We can focus on other areas from there. But we really need to make a decision on this front. So I think that's where our focus is right now. If you have any other thoughts feel free to send those along, and we'll try to get them in the model or incorporate them. But please think about these 2, and including the piece that Rick mentioned there, and that we talked about was the fact that anything we make over here, we'll have to think about parameters akin to either our current zoning or the 40R. And in either case, whatever we do there, we'll have to comply with MBTA. So just think about that as we're thinking about the zoning in that area, if it's a new district. Anybody else want to say anything before we depart?
Andy, we'll be in touch, but I'll be on vacation the 18th, so I'll be sure to get you all that information, and we'll touch base beforehand. So apologies to the group, but I think you'll have all the details that I'll communicate with Andy.
Okay, thanks, Ian. All right, thanks everybody. Appreciate your time, and
Thank you.
we'll circle back.
Thanks.
Have a good night, everybody.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.